everyone, this is Eve Picker, and if you listen to this podcast series, you're going to learn how to make some change. Hi there. Thanks so much for joining me today for the latest episode of Impact Real Estate Investing. My guest today is Liz Falletta. Liz teaches architectural and urban design at USC's Price School of Public Policy, where she's taught for over 15 years. But that's not all Liz does by a long stretch. Liz is also a small-scale developer, having developed, painfully, one of LA's first small lot subdivision projects. She sits on LA's Zoning Advisory Committee, which is tasked with critiquing the city's Recode LA project, a $5 million five-year plan to overhaul the zoning code. And last but not least, Liz has just published a book by Right by Design, where she researched housing solutions. Be sure to go to evepicker.com to find out more about Liz on the show notes page for this episode. And be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you can access information about impact real estate investing and get the latest news about the exciting projects on my crowdfunding platform, Small Change. Hi, Liz. Thank you very much for joining me all the way from California. It's earlier for you than me, right?
Yes.
So I know you teach architecture and urban design at the University of Southern California's Price School of Public Policy. Mm-hmm. I think you also have your own development firm, wrote a book, and you were one of the first developers to develop a small lot subdivision in LA. So you're a very busy woman.
I do teach design across disciplines at the Price School at USC. I'm an architect, and for a long time I taught in our architecture school, but now I'm exclusively in our policy planning environment. So thinking about design from multiple perspectives is something that I do a lot. I guess it's been a long time now since I did that small lot subdivision project, and I think I've blocked a lot of it out.
Well, I wanted to hear a little bit about your development work. What prompted you to test out the small lot subdivision? And it might be worth telling our listeners a little bit about that zoning code overlay, which I kind of find fascinating.
The small lot subdivision came out of an effort by the LA Planning Department in 2004, 2005 to really address housing and our mounting housing crisis, which is now even more of a crisis. And they actually invited an interdisciplinary group of designers, developers, planners, other stakeholders in housing to brainstorm, what are some ideas from a policy planning perspective that could engender housing production. And the small lot, or AKA zero lot line housing, was one of hundreds, I think, and was really the one that got pursued. And I think the idea was if you were able to scale down home ownership and also allow development outside a condominium model, because really what the small lot allows is fee simple home ownership on a smaller scale. So contractors and builders don't have to get onerous builder's risk insurance like they do when they build condominiums.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, it's and I think planners really thought that the smaller scale would create for more affordable housing.
Yeah, well, I've seen some of that, and it's not affordable, is it?
No, that is the thing that struck me so the most is that, if you build a small lot in Venice on the west side, it's going to be $2 million a unit because it's the west side. And, if you build one in Silver Lake, it'll be $1.5 million. Smaller scale solutions, I think, are a good option. I think ultimately, after having done one and having seen how the small lot has evolved since I did the one that I worked on, I think it's one tool amongst many. I think what it does do is it sort of maximizes the use of infrastructure that's already in place. So I know that there are cities all over the world kind of densifying or areas through zoning so that they can maximize their transit corridors and utility lines and, one little house in the middle of a very large lot in a
a highly desirable neighborhood doesn't really, it just makes the sprawl go further, right?
Exactly. No, and I think one of the things that was actually brilliant about the way the ordinance was written is that it didn't have anything to do with the zone change at all. It had nothing to do with zoning. It just allowed you to use lower density multifamily zoned sites in a different way. They might have been built as apartments or condominiums before, but this allowed we have a restricted density zone, for example, probably 20 dwelling units an acre density wise. And it allowed those sites to be developed with for sale housing, which at the time was, the small lot subdivision came out pre-crash.
Right. If you were to rewrite that today, what would you change? What would you change about that small lot subdivision overlay?
That's such a good question. I do think because it's actually not an overlay, but I think using it as an overlay and being more targeted and specific about where it can be used and how, I think would be helpful.
Oh, so it's just LA wide. It's just a change to the zone.
It's LA wide.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just an ordinance that allows you to develop with a different model. It was sort of marketed as small houses on small lots, and it really has turned into giant houses on small lots.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah. So
it's like an interesting lesson in how much you have to think about the details of a code like that.
Well, and also you have to, I feel terrible saying this, you have to think about the bad actors.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Who's going to abuse this and how?
So this is not a democracy. It's democracy.
Exactly. Yeah. How do we head off the bad acting? And I think we saw a lot of really bulky design that communities pushed back against. You saw a lot of projects, there were a lot of single family homes that were built on multifamily zoned sites. So you saw a lot of turnover of those kinds of sites, and communities in the main don't really understand zoning.
Yes, that's right.
And we're very upset to see houses, being demolished to build these giant things. Then a lot of rent controlled small scale housing from the 20s, 30s, and 40s has been demolished to build them also. So,
yeah, I mean, maybe even just saying that if you have the privilege of adding more units to a lot like that, there's a maximum size to each of them would have kind of stopped that. It's interesting. So what other development are you doing?
So I have done development in the past. I did 2 or 3 small lots also that in the end didn't get built. Then the market crash happened. And then I started teaching full time. And then I started writing this book, which it turns out takes a long time to write a book. So
yes. So that's taken over. So, okay.
Yeah. But I am actually, I should say, looking to do another development. I feel like I learned a lot by doing all the research for the book. And, I would like to get back into small scale development in LA.
What's enticing about small scale development?
Partially, it's just the financial scale.
In LA, small scale is still really big, expensive, right?
Still pretty expensive. But also, I think that's where we can build successful communities. I mean, not that we can't have large scale communities that are successful, but I think neighborhood change in giant steps is not palatable to communities, and I think smaller scale changes can be really impactful.
Right. So it's a way to innovate change slowly.
Yeah.
And gently, right?
Yeah. And in ways that people can embrace and see immediate benefit from, as opposed to, this 200 unit housing project, that assembled 10 lots and suddenly the neighborhood is totally different.
Yeah, I think that's right. So your work focuses a lot on LA. What conditions have you found that are unique to LA versus just across the country in the research that you've done?
One of the reasons why this research was well suited to LA is we really do have a strong history of design innovation, but also a really interesting history of multifamily housing and different multifamily housing types. And they're different types than we see maybe in Chicago or New York And then we also see these types have persisted. Our city is younger than many on the East Coast. And so these types are still extant in a way that maybe they aren't in some other communities. And I think also, LA has the reputation, and it's somewhat true, super pro-growth, really driven by development and developers. So there's long been a close association with the city, with the development as a profession.
Be sure to go to evepicker.com and sign up for my free educational newsletter about impact real estate investing. You'll be among the first to hear about new projects you can invest in. That's evepicker.com. Thanks so much. Your book is called By Right, By Design. I'd love to know how you came to that name.
So by right, as I'm sure you know, just means by right projects can be built with ministerial approvals. So approvals where nobody can say, if you meet all the criteria and the criteria are laid out, nobody can deny approval for your project. And developers really like by right projects or permissionless projects because they're a lot more certain and they're less risky and they usually take less time. Developers would prefer to build by right if they can. That's become increasingly impossible in Los Angeles. And there's been a lot of discussion about by right housing, elevating the threshold of by right and actually making more projects able to be built by right. For my purposes, I needed a second category that was a corollary to by right. And that's where by design came from, because the book really looks at a set of 6 case studies that look at really famous Los Angeles housing precedents by famous architects, aka by design, with their by right counterparts. So by design could also mean by discretion or by variance. So all of the by design projects actually required some sort of discretionary approval to be built.
Interesting. And do you think they're better?
Not always, actually.
That's interesting.
No, because one of the questions I had when I started out on this is I'm wondering if all these projects that are really famous, that I studied in architecture school, I wonder if they broke the rules, if they could only do these innovative things by not following the rules. It was true. They all required variances of different kinds. I don't think being by design means they're necessarily better or better designed, or that if they're in the by right category, they're poorly designed. So one of the things that really started this research is some annoyance at the fact that architects always believe that unless it was designed by them, it's not really well designed. And B, and I should also say that I'm a licensed architect, but that they really thought more design was always better in every situation. And it's not necessarily true. And I was frustrated.
That's a pretty damning thing for an architect to say.
No, I'm sorry. I'm an architect. It's bad. I guess typically what I say is I think design really, really, really matters. It just doesn't matter in the way that many architects think it does.
How so?
So I think architects are trained to be innovative all the time, to be focused on image, to be focused on creating things that are new, that are this, that are that. And I think that allows them to not see or to discount other aspects of design that are maybe tried and true or repetitive or something that actually really matter to quality of life. Because I think the design of housing, for example, really matters. But I think what really matters about it is a lot about density, about spatial organization, about circulation, about how common space and open space is organized. I should say also, I think there are a lot of amazing architects doing really great projects who don't maybe share these attitudes. But I think the profession focuses less on these things, doesn't feel like these things are as important.
Yeah, as you know, I'm also a trained architect, and
yes.
I went to the dark side too and became a developer. Yeah, but I had sort of similar frustrations with the architecture profession, which I adore. I think that architects are trained in a unique and priceless way. So, but I think they are not necessarily, especially young architects, don't really understand how much they've learned and how they can put that to use in other ways and follow a traditional, path, with in sort of that branded architecture studio that may not always make the world better.
Yeah.
I wish they'd learn a little more about real estate development as well, because sort of the pragmatic side of architecture is sometimes overlooked, right? I remember having conversations with an architect about the fact that 5 units would be so much nicer than 6. And I'm thinking, well, 5 units won't be built and 6 will be, so it's that sort of basic thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, because that 6th unit is your profit. Like, that's your cash flow.
Or our break even. It may not even be perfect.
Exactly. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because I wanted to help architects and planners and real estate developers better understand each other's goals and values, so that architect could use his understanding of the profit motive in real estate to get his or her own goals addressed or met or something. Because if architects just sit there and say real estate developers are terrible because they don't understand that, the 5-unit design is going to be better than the 6-unit design, that's completely unhelpful.
Yeah.
Is not going to get us anywhere. I think what architects don't understand is they have an interest, a vested interest in the planning and real estate development strategies of the projects they design, right? So a good example from the book is Gregory Ains' Mar Vista tract, which had a very enlightened developer who had done some development in the 20s, early 20s, hadn't done anything in the 30s during the Depression, and really wanted to build a community, which is fantastic. Ain was also very interested in that. And they got a lot of pushback from lenders, and they got a lot of pushback from the city planning department in terms of how it was laid out and the style of the houses, and did it have flat roofs or not. And, so ultimately they could only build half of the tract, and that half was a financial failure. So if people wonder why we don't have modernist communities, that is one reason.
Yeah.
So, they had to sell off the rest of their land, and it got developed in the traditional kind of manner.
Talking about by right, I know you're a fan of the recent offering we had on Small Change, Bungalow Gardens, which is in your neck of the woods. It's a little homeless housing project. And I believe that's a by right project. And I'm wondering why you like that project.
So I personally would love to build a bungalow court for myself. My goal I think a lot of people have this goal, it's going to be hard to do here in Los Angeles, is everybody wants to build the compound where you can live with your friends and have communal dinners. And actually, also, I should say the first place I lived when I moved to Los Angeles was a very small bungalow court in Venice.
Oh, cool.
And it was interesting. I moved out here from DC to go to SCI-Arc actually for grad school. Finding housing was really interesting, because I had lived in a row house, I think, in DC, in a basement apartment. I'd never encountered a bungalow court, but I was driving around and everybody loves them. They're the best places to live.
Well, that's really sweet.
Yeah. No, I mean, your neighbors immediately, you see them.
And how big are they typically? Like,
oh gosh. They can be relatively large, but the one I lived in was probably 6 units, 8 units.
And for our listeners, the bungalow court typology, I think, stopped being built in the 50s, right?
Really much earlier than that. Probably the latest ones are in the 30s.
In the 30s. So this little one that Jason and John built, or a building, Bungalow Gardens, is the first one in almost 100 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can't build them now, mainly because of the parking requirements, but also just underlying density is reflected in land values. So, you can't basically, if I wanted to build a bungalow court, I would overpay for land and then underdevelop it. Part of what makes the bungalow court work really is the scale and the individuality of units. And, many of the units actually, these were often built for tourists because people would come to LA for their health, but would also, it took a long time to get here then. So you stayed for months. So they had all this built-in furniture and fun things that allowed you to live in the unit easily for a few months, as opposed to having to bring all your belongings and actually move here for real. So they're very efficient. They're laid out really very functional. They've got a lot, they're high in terms of individuality. So you have a lot of identity with your unit and your space. But then there's that communal scale. The actual courtyard usually then connects to the block and the street.
It's very nice little typology.
Yeah, it's just, if we could all live in bungalow courts, we would.
Yeah, but maybe the issue is not just by right and by design, but also by cost, because the cost of land. So the cost of land clearly drives development as well, right?
You have done your deal when you bought the land, right?
Yes.
Like if you overpay for land, you're done.
Yeah.
You have determined sort of what kind of project you're going to do and whether that project's going to be a success or not.
And how does all of that fit in with affordable housing?
One of the other benefits of building small scale housing, and even the whole explosion of ADUs, is many of those are going to hopefully provide inherently affordable housing as opposed to subsidized affordable housing. Getting subsidized affordable housing, we just haven't been able to build a huge number of units. There's a lot of competition for those funds. We now have transit-oriented communities. It does incentivize the development of affordable units and mixed-use projects. You get some extra density and some parking reductions if you're near transit, and they have a pretty liberal definition of transit. And I do think that is generating way more affordable units than maybe some of our other mechanisms have in the past.
Interesting. So zoning becomes a serious mechanism for affordable housing. So actually, that brings me to the other thing I'd like to talk to you about. I think you were appointed to LA's Zoning Advisory Committee, the Recode project, and you're one of not many people who are critiquing that and leading a subcommittee on housing, right?
Yes. I was just talking about this with my students yesterday and realizing that I needed to check in with people at the city because we haven't had a meeting in a while. So LA's zoning code that we are still using today was officially kind of created in 1946, even though we had a code prior to that. We had residential districts as early as 1908. Our code has been frustrating to use for, it sort of makes it really difficult for people to do good projects, the kind of projects that the city wants to see. Mixed use has always been a problem with our code because it's very single use oriented. So it was confusing to use. And there was also a substantial sort of phantom code or ghost code that if you were in the know, you knew.
Oh, really?
You didn't. Yeah, like that wasn't very transparent. It meant that certain people got certain favors. The planning department wanted to do several things. One, make the code more user-friendly. I think two, make it more modular. So basically, it's a form-based light code, so it disassociates use and form. So the idea is that the modularity will make the code more flexible, but then also, as people want to do different kinds of projects, the tools are already there in terms of making a zone combination that will facilitate that kind of project. And then I think the third thing they wanted to do is elevate by right processes. So
interesting.
So allow more projects to be built by right, because virtually no projects are built by right.
Yeah, and the entitlement process takes a really long time in LA.
Oh, yeah. No, the first Smollett project I did was a real education because I was like, this makes no sense.
How long did it take?
Oh my God. At least 2 years. Yeah.
Oh.
It was like banging your head against a wall.
No, I know with a bungalow court listing, I talked to them probably for 2 years before we listed it.
Mm-hmm.
And all along the way, there was entitlement,
Mm-hmm.
right up
Mm-hmm.
to the end.
Yeah. Well, and what I learned is that part of that is inherent in development. Like every week, something happens that's going to kill your project. It's just how it is
Yes.
here. And, I would get upset and there would be crying. And finally, after a few months of this, I was like, oh, this is what development is. This is how it works. Okay. I need to not get so upset about this because, it'll kill me, A. And B, that's the worksite traffic control inspector. Sure, he's going to deny your worksite traffic control plan. That I even had to have a worksite traffic control plan was ridiculous. But
how many units are we talking about?
Four.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. And they already existed. Like I was using the ordinance. The ordinance was silent on whether it had to be new construction or if it could be existing construction. So basically I bought 2 duplexes on a big lot and cut the duplexes apart and, cut the big lot into 4.
And it took 2 years to get it approved.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
It was insane. And then they wanted me to build a public sewer.
Oh.
Yeah. No, it was, I think my experience was maybe more extreme than some.
I had the public sewer experience in Pittsburgh once.
Did you?
Yes, the sewer was out on the main street and they've been wanting to move it into the alley for a long time behind the building. And our building was at least 600 feet from the crossroad. And they wanted us to lay the entire line to the building. So every other building on both sides of the alley could feed into it. It was really awful.
Yeah. No, they wanted me to build an 8-inch line with a manhole on my property for 4 1-bedroom, 1-bath units.
So now you're in the middle of the Recode project. And how long has that been going on?
It was supposed to be a 5-year project. So it's gone on 6 and maybe 7 years now.
For a 5-year project.
Yeah. 5 years, $5 million. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Do you think that it's going to be successful? Are there pitfalls that you're seeing already?
There are many pitfalls, I think. One is mixed messaging about the project and what it would do. I think they promoted it differently to different constituencies. That's fine, but they have not been very, very clear about that. I think, too, this is a critique of urban planning. I think there's a whole sector of urban planning that feels like if they did 800 community outreach meetings, they've done their job. And I don't think that's the measure of whether this is successful or not.
Yeah.
I kept getting, emails. We've had 800 meetings. And I'm like, great.
Wow, that's a lot of meetings.
It was a lot of meetings. It definitely was. And then thirdly, these zones are basically being applied in a community planning process. So, and I unfortunately know very little about planning on the other cities or the East Coast, but in California, every city has a general plan, which is sort of the constitution for growth and development, has different elements. One of them is about land use and planning for land use. And in the city of LA, we have 35 different community plans that basically apply zoning and apply various planning tools to specific parcels and talk about how neighborhoods are going to grow and change.
Right.
And we don't update those very often. Like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, we'd updated 4 or 5 in the past 20 years. We didn't update them very often. And what that meant for the zoning code was that most communities wouldn't see the benefit of this new code for decades, right? And we'd have a dual kind of code system. The mayor then vowed to update all the community plans within 6 years. And I don't know the status of that right now.
It sounds like a monster project.
Yeah, no, it's just, I fear that it was oversold and people aren't really going to see the benefit of it.
Oh, that's a shame. So what do you think is the best possible outcome for this code overhaul for LA?
What all of us really focused on was identifying and reducing the barriers, which are legion, But then there was a lot of, I think there are a lot of people out there. I'm one of these people who I want to do interesting small projects, and I can't for a variety of reasons. And, you have to cobble together. It's so interesting to me that the Bungalow Gardens project really could only exist because it's in a TOC designation, because they don't have to have parking.
Oh, and probably because the developer is a nonprofit. I mean, they spent 2 years on that project, and I don't know what for-profit developer could do that.
Right. No, a for-profit developer would slide right past that project, or at least definitely not do it in the same way.
And yet they got an award for innovation on that project. So there's something really broken, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. No, and part of the reason also that I wrote the book is I think, we're having to have a citywide conversation about housing and how to produce it. And our ability to have that conversation is just as broken as all the tools that we use, to try to generate housing, affordable housing that costs $500,000 to $700,000 a unit to build. I'm even beginning to think that these sort of silos that we exist in are a problem when we think about gentrification. Also, it stops the conversation. You just don't get anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's kind of depressing.
Yes, I'm sorry. No,
yeah. I think, John Perfett said something actually in the podcast I did with him and Jason about the work they do as a nonprofit housing developer that I think was really sad. And that was engagement of community is very difficult for them and very expensive if they're going to, and it's kind of had the reverse impact on involving community, because if they're going to spend a long time on a housing project, they simply can't afford to have it shut down by someone at the end of a 2-year process. They don't have the money for it.
Yeah.
And that means that they almost have to avoid some community engagement, which is kind of the reverse that you want, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that's one of the big reasons also that you've seen more housing initiatives in California at the state level, people interested in taking some local control over housing away because communities have shut down projects, basically because they're only looking at them from a singular perspective, which is their own. And we can't move forward as a city with that. For a long time, Christopher Hawthorne, who is now the city designer, forget exactly what his title is, but he was the architecture critic for the LA Times for a long time. And then Mayor Garcetti hired him recently. Basically, his analysis of the city really was, for a long time, we had enough space to be 10 different cities. We could be the industrial engine. We could be the idyllic single family home in the garden. We could be the diverse multifamily community, but now we've run out of space. So all of those images and versions of the city are competing with one another and conflicting. So we have to have a higher level conversation. There needs to be a lot better education of the public about housing.
Yeah.
And how housing works.
So just on a broader level, impact investing. I mean, how do you think it's aligned with real estate and the importance of it in your mind?
Well, like I said, I was super excited to be able to invest in John and Jason's project. I actually have been teaching design to real estate development students for about 16 years, increasingly horrifying amount of time. And it's interesting, the evolution of the students that I've encountered. Because when I first started doing it, none of them thought design was important. None of them wanted to be there. I got ones on my evaluations. Everybody hated me. And it was demoralizing and terrible. Now, the students are not only aware of, issues of gentrification, really aware of the perception communities have of developers and development, aware of social issues like homelessness. And also they're really interested in building communities and innovative communities. I think the interest in impact investing is going to track that. I mean, I think my generation screwed it up or was part of the problem. I think I think kids in their 20s and 30s are going to really change things.
They really care about the world, I think.
They do, climate change. And I think they really understand development as a responsibility, as opposed to a way to make money. Don't get me wrong, they want to make money, totally. But it's interesting, a lot of them have fathers or mothers who are developers, and their parents' development practices really bother them. Like they're like, my dad doesn't spend any money on this thing that I think is really important. Things are changing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think my parents didn't think that way either. And a definite shift, right? Which is great.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how it happened. I'm not sure I know. I don't know if you have children because I don't. I just see the students and see how they shift and change. But
yeah. Well, I think climate change is there, and people are thinking about it at a much earlier age, and that surely has to impact the way they think about the world. And then there's so much access to information easily.
That's true.
That a generation or two ago we just didn't have. So there's more knowledge more access to knowledge, whether it's fake or not. I mean, you have to sift through it all, right? But there's just more access. I don't know. I think all of those things together are changing things. So
I think too, their expectations have changed in terms of how they're going to live. They don't all assume they're going to buy single family homes, either because that's out of reach or because it's just not something they're going to value.
Or because it's illegal in some cities now.
Right, exactly.
So I'm gonna sign off now. We've been talking for a while, but I wanted to ask you 3 questions that I ask everyone, and that is, what's the key factor that makes a real estate project impactful to you? What really matters to you?
So I talk about triple win projects in the book, and these are projects that perform well from the perspective of design, planning, and development. And for me, that's the real hallmark of a good quality project, because the interesting thing to me was, the projects that balanced those perspectives from their inception really were the more resilient projects over time, in terms of being valuable projects from all 3 perspectives. The Village Green, which is a really famous garden apartment project in LA, is a really good example. It was definitely innovative when it was built, but also very financially successful when it was built, and really, really created a community. And it's performed well on all those measures throughout its history.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Other than by raising money, do you think that crowdfunding could benefit, small scale or impact real estate developers like you?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about using it as a tool, but I do think, as John and Jason talked about it is an interesting way to do community outreach and involve neighbors in projects. I think that is pretty brilliant. Giving people the opportunity to invest in something next door. I think it's probably also a really great networking tool. I could imagine that for John and Jason, the people who invested in this project are probably going to invest in other projects.
Yeah, I think that might be the case.
Yeah, and connect to.
We can only hope, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm up for it. So.
Yeah. We hope that they build more. And then if there were one thing that you would change to improve real estate development in the United States,
oh gosh,
what would that be?
What would that be? Oh, that's such a good question. I think it really comes down to bad acting. So I think a lot of our policy is retroactive and is responding to bad acting instead of promoting high quality, community oriented projects created by people with good intention.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess that's really about changing the culture of the profession, which I do think is changing. Maybe it could change quicker.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you. You as well.
Actually, I have another question for you, Liz.
Okay.
I think I'm going to add in. And then what's next for you now you've written the book?
Oh, gosh. I have to say that yes, it is. I'm doing some book promotion, and I am looking for a real estate project right now in between teaching, and also I've been teaching now for nearly 25 years, and I'm wondering if it might be time for a larger scale change, maybe doing something more entrepreneurial with real estate.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Keep me posted.
I will.
Okay. Thanks, Liz.
Okay. Thanks so much. Take care.
That was Liz Falletta. What an amazing woman. Here are some of the takeaways from what Liz shared with us today. First, through research from her book, By Right by Design, Liz learned that more design is not always better. She also learned that some of the best housing solutions might not be the most innovative designs. And over the years, her students have evolved from not caring one iota about design to caring very much today, and that bodes well for the future of cities. You can find out more about impact real estate investing and access the show notes for today's episode at my website, evepicker.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to find out more about how to make money in real estate while building better cities. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today, and thank you, Liz, for sharing your thoughts with me. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.